Now, our next speaker is not only one of the foremost historians of the Second World War, he has also been, and for all I know may still be, Times editor of the, and I want you to take this word very seriously, complete history of the world. This guy knows a thing or two. He's also a man of whom the late Eric Hobsbawm called erudite, which coming from Hobsbawm is a compliment indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Overy.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. I'm going to approach this debate from an entirely different angle. And indeed, I think between us we've divided up the debate, I think, two very different ways. What I'm going to talk about today are about strategic options and about the options that were open to the RAF or indeed to the British war effort during the course of the Second World War. And I want to start off by reminding us of the two strategic aims that bombing was supposed to have when it was undertaken in 1940. The first is that it would unhinge the enemy's war effort. The second thing is that it might produce a political dividend by profoundly demoralizing the enemy population, compelling them to put pressure on the Hitler government and possibly producing surrender. Now, there are three things, I think, to observe first about these ambitions. The first is that in 1940 or 39, when the RAF thought about doing this, there was no evidence that a sustained bombing campaign would do either of those things. Indeed, the only evidence there'd been was a rather half-hearted and small bombing offensive at the end of the First World War, whose results were completely inconclusive. The only experience that the RAF had had of bombing, of course, was so-called colonial policing, in which a handful of aircraft would fly over some kind of tribal enclave, drop some bombs, drive the tribe to surrender, and as a result, allowing the RAF to claim that bombing had immediate and clear results. The serious bombing in the 1930s was in the Spanish Civil War. And what's striking, I think, is that the RAF was among the major air forces the only one that looked at the Spanish Civil War and did not draw the obvious conclusion that bombing didn't achieve a great deal, but that aircraft in support of ground forces, whether naval forces or the army, did achieve a great deal. And indeed, it explains why the Soviet Air Force, the German Air Force, and the French Air Force, by 1940-41, were more or less air forces committed to combined arms operations in support of the surface forces. The third thing is preparation. Many of you, I'm sure, know the story that by 1940, Bomber Command, despite all the commitment of the 1920s and 1930s, was fundamentally unprepared to launch an operation of any magnitude against the German homeland, and indeed was unable to do so until well into 1943. What's even more striking, I think, is the paradox that at precisely the time that Bomber Command was thinking about what it was going to be doing in the late 1930s, a great deal of Britain's air effort was being devoted to building up our radar chain and fighter command and extensive civil defences, precisely to demonstrate that it was possible to combat bombing. The bomber would not always get through. And the RAF operated in 1940 with extraordinary schizophrenia, one half of it saying we could defend well against bombing, or effectively enough, the other saying that we could bomb and achieve something decisive. My argument is that by 1940, there really was no strategic justification for what it was that Bomber Command was claiming. In that sense, the campaign, once it got going, was not really strategically justifiable. Now, what made this point even more obvious, of course, was the Blitz. The Blitz demonstrated, if you needed demonstration, first of all, that long-term and intensive bombing did not break morale. Indeed, this was the biggest offensive it had ever been. There never had been an offensive in which 43,000 civilians were killed away from the fighting front. Here it was. There were scares, of course, people worried about it, but in fact, as we all know, British morale did not break. Nor was the British economy affected much by the Blitz. Calculations made in the summer of 1941 by the Ministry of Home Security showed that Britain's economic potential had been reduced by about 5% and was quickly made up again after May 1941. Now, all of this was known to the RAF and discussed, indeed, in the Air Ministry. So there had to be some additional justification for why you wanted to persist with a bombing campaign. One of them was the argument that the Germans were nowhere near as tough as the British. You bomb the Germans, they're bullies by nature, it was said. They will fold up where the British didn't fold up. The other was to look at some of the evidence from the Blitz and to distort it or misinterpret it. The most obvious example I've come across was the evidence of absenteeism. A great deal of anxiety about whether bombing would stop workers going to work, whether they'd stay away for months, whether production would collapse as a result. So the Ministry of Home Security undertook a number of detailed studies of places that had been heavily bombed, and they found that workers in fact returned in most cases within 2 or 3 days. In Liverpool, even in Clydebank, which was heavily hit by bombers, in the end, 3/4 or more of workers were back at work after 2 or 3 days. They needed to, of course. They needed to be paid. They needed to look after their families. Now, this evidence was, in fact, used by Lord Cherwell and others to argue for the dehousing and bombing of German cities by looking at those figures, simply disregarding what they showed. Churchill was told that the evidence from Hull and Liverpool and so on made it clear that if you bombed heavily enough, workers would stay away from work. It wasn't true, and it wasn't true in Germany. In 1944, absenteeism rates as a result of bombing were around about 4% of all absenteeism. There was a great deal more absenteeism as a result of regular leave, holidays, or illness. Nonetheless, Bomber Command persisted, and I have to say that they persisted in the teeth of a great deal of criticism from the Army and the Navy that would have liked those aircraft to be used for something else and those resources to be diverted to something else. And at the end of the war, what was the outcome? Well, we've heard already this evening that bombing achieved a great deal. Well, it did. It flattened a lot of cities and killed 350,000 people. But in terms of economic effects, those were muted. Even by 1944, when Germany was being subjected to the heaviest air assault there's ever been, it was possible to expand output considerably up until September of that year. And German morale, of course, never cracked in the sense that people hoped it would. There was never a political overthrow or a political crisis. Now, I want to end by saying that, interestingly enough, this is not just my view, it was also the view of the RAF. In 1947, Lord Tedder, who had been Eisenhower's deputy and was now Chief of Staff, conducted what was called Exercise Thunderbolt. It was a high-level exercise for 3 or 4 days where a whole lot of airmen and experts came together and they looked back and they thought about what bombing had done and was it worthwhile. I'm very struck by 2 speeches which were made by Norman Bottomley, who was the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, the man responsible for sending the orders to Harris all the time during the last part of the war. And what Bottomley said was, we have to be honest about Bomber Command. It was completely unprepared and didn't know what it was doing in the first 2 or 3 years of the campaign. But the critical question, what did it do, forced him to conclude in this audience, first of all, that morale in Germany was never critically affected by bombing, and secondly, that the industrial system of Germany, located in its major cities, was also never critically undermined by bombing. And I think that's quite a stunning indictment of a campaign which Bottomley was, of course, partly responsible for conducting. Now, the implication of what I've said, and I'm concluding now, the implication of what I've said, of course, is those resources might well have been used for something else. What else could they have been used for? Well, this is a counterfactual, and I'm not going to spend time now exploring all that those counterfactual possibilities. But if it's something anybody wants to raise in the discussion afterwards, I'd certainly be happy to respond to it. Thank you very much.